China says it will fight to the end against the United States to safeguard its interests. President Donald Trump is threatening an additional 50% tariff on Chinese imports. A statement from China's Ministry of Commerce added that the new US tariffs were groundless and a typical unilateral bullying practice. Beijing promised countermeasures after some Asian stock markets reopened with slightly better results following a volatile day of trading on Monday, to say the least. Japanese, Australian and South Korean shares improved their positions. The Nikkei index opened around 2% higher and continued to improve as we came to air. It follows a week of turmoil, which began with Trump's actions to correct what he calls unfair trade practices.
Trillions of dollars being wiped off stocks worldwide. And still, no sign of a pause in US President Donald Trump's tariff turmoil. Shrugging off the market reaction, Trump says he intends to impose further tariffs on China if it doesn't withdraw the 34% it imposed on US products last week.
They put a 34% tariff on above what their ridiculous tariffs were already. And I said, if that tariff isn't removed by tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we're putting a 50% tariff on above the tariffs that we put on.
Trump announced tariffs on imports from about 90 countries last week. China was one of his biggest targets.
If you look at that, China, first row.
Beijing has vowed to respond with defiance. An anchor of state broadcaster CCTV read out a statement from China's Ministry of Commerce.
The so-called reciprocal tariffs imposed by the US on China are groundless and a typical unilateral bullying practice. The countermeasures that China has taken are to safeguard its sovereignty, security and development interests and to maintain the normal international trade order, which is completely legitimate. The US threat to escalate tariffs on China is a mistake on top of a mistake and exposes again the blackmail nature of the United States. China will never accept it and will fight to the end.
Meanwhile, the EU has offered the Trump administration a zero-for-zero deal on industrial goods. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the bloc is also preparing itself should talks break down.
So it's very clear that we are open for negotiations and that in parallel we are preparing a potential list for retaliation and other measures for retaliation if this is necessary. We prefer to have a negotiated solution.
At least 50 other countries have reached out to the US government to begin trade negotiations and get better deals. But Trump has so far only sent mixed signals about his willingness to do so.
Not the full. We could take the full 88%. Thanks a lot. He's doing a very good job. How's he doing? All right.
Melissa Chan is in Taipei for us. Good to see you, Melissa. We've already seen what happens when China responds with the same force. This sounds like all-out economic war now.
Well, if it is economic war, Beijing is ready for it. And something that President Trump has to keep in mind is that Beijing and China is an authoritarian state, which means that they can tolerate a lot of pain. Their citizens can tolerate a lot of pain because their citizens can't really give feedback in terms of elections. In terms of which country is actually going to last if they're going to be in this standoff, President Trump still is running a democracy that is going to have elections, and we are seeing people, of course, in the United States, across the United States, protesting. So that is a calculus that Beijing is very much aware of. There's actually a Chinese term called 吃苦, eat bitterness, and it's actually part of Chinese nationalist propaganda that the citizens can take a hit for medium and long-term gains.
Tell us how Asian nations elsewhere in the region are responding.
So China might be responding very fiercely, but here in Taiwan, for example, with Taiwan being very dependent and reliant on the United States as a security guarantor, there's not much option in terms of what they can do. They can't really quite hit back, and that's why you have the president here saying that he's not going to retaliate, and two, that he offers a zero tariff deal with the United States. It's going to very much, of course, depend on what President Trump says. Elsewhere across East Asia, you have Seoul and Tokyo walking a bit of a line between China's position and Taiwan's more conciliatory position. But for Seoul and Tokyo, the big question is what kind of relationship they want with the United States in the medium and long term. There is an element of unreliability that is a shock to the system for a lot of people in Seoul and Tokyo.
Could Trump actually bring the region closer together? Could we see some sort of cooperation come out of this?
And that's what's really fascinating, because in the last week or so, you have had government representatives from China, South Korea, and Japan meet to talk about the economy. And it's not often that you get this kind of trilateral. In fact, first of all, it was the Biden administration that managed to get Japan and South Korea to sit down with each other. And that was considered a big win for the United States. And that was the previous trilateral of the United States, Japan, and South Korea. With South Korea and Japan, of course, very concerned at that time about the China threat. But here is the possibility, at least the Chinese are certainly very interested in pushing the possibility of restarting trilateral free trade agreement discussions with Tokyo and Seoul in this very new situation where both Seoul and Tokyo are looking at the United States as the unpredictable one, as the one that is a threat.
That word predictability is something being thrown around a lot at the moment, and the uncertainty which is causing a lot of pain on stock markets for private investors as well. What sort of economic pain can we expect short term?
I think the thing to keep in mind is that the pain isn't just in the stock markets around the world, and especially in Asia, where it is such a global manufacturing hub. Let's just say that the Japanese cut a deal with the United States. It doesn't mean that Japan is scot-free and they're going to be out in the clear. The economies within Asia are very, very connected. Just as an example, Taiwanese companies have manufacturing plants in China. Chinese companies invest in manufacturing in Southeast Asia. So, even if there's a bilateral agreement with Washington, D.C. between any of these countries, they're fixing one problem, but the overall picture is one that is still very unstable.
Thank you very much for your reporting, Melissa Chan, there in Taipei for us.